In today's lecture, we're looking at Ntosake Shange and her work for colored girls who have considered suicide when the rainbow is enough. Shange is really is a very innovative playwright who I think, in many ways, um, first of all, invented, sort of constructed a new poetics and a new theatrical form called the Courier poem, which has influenced so many other writers and playwrights over time. Stylistically, her work falls within the category of the body theater, the theater that was propagated by the directors and impresarios like Jerzy Grotowski, the Polish director, and to some extent Peter Brook. These are the British innovator and director, and many of their followers. In many ways, the theater that they developed was a theater that believed in a kind of physicality, that believed in the idea of the body as a kind of holy presence on the stage, and in a sense, it worked in kind of in counter distinction to the more traditional form that was made popular, sort of made established as a kind of theatrical practice for the 20th century, which is the Stanislavski technique. Stanislavski was one of the major directors, theater directors in Russia at the early 20th century, and directed a number of Chekhov's plays. Stanislavski's sort of practice, the technique and approach, really was seeking a kind of realistic theatrical performance, but a performance that was siphoned. All emotionality was siphoned out, and what was happening was a method was being created to capture what would be articulated by the script, and therefore the method called for a kind of reaching into one's own memory, into a memory that was similar to the experience that the play was describing, the character was describing in the play, and then drawing upon those emotions to then imbue them, to imbue the character with these emotions for the stage. So this is what you hear, and it's called the method acting, a method acting form that really took the U.S. In by in a massive storm in the 1940s and 1950s. People like Marlon Brando began to do it, and I think what we get of actors like Dustin Hoffman and so on are what we call method actors, actors like Sidney Poitier, Harry Belafonte. In the middle of that, in the middle of the 20th century, of course, they evolved the Brechtian theater. And the Brechtian theater seemed to suggest an opposite approach, an approach that proposed that, again, the method acting that Stanislavski advocated did not seem to be radical enough. So Brechtian theater was a theater of protest, a theater of political consciousness and political awareness. And Brecht, therefore, literally broke down what we call the fourth wall, that is, the relationship between the audience and the actor. And in a sense, they were acting as if they were acting. In other words, they were actors on stage. And in some ways, what we see with Ntosake Shange, with her choreo poem style, is the beginning of a kind of embrace of this idea that it's a total theater, that the entire theater is part of the stage, that actors are engaged in it in those ways. And it's interesting because if we think about the evolution and the development of that play and the concept of the choreo poem, we begin to recognize that innovation came out of a poetics. Uh, Ntosake described the play for colored girls as a series of poems. In fact, in describing how this play came about, she had written these poems, and she was an active poet. And she had written these poems in multiple voices, but also largely in her voice, and decided then to find a way to stage this poem. And in the staging of the poem, it involved adding dance, adding song, drawing on popular culture, drawing on all these kinds of elements, and therefore what you can think of is that these are all individual poems that are going to be linked by a sort of larger concept, a larger concept of the experience of women of color in in American society in the 1970s. Now, of course, what is interesting also is in the staging of it. Very little props, if any at all, and all the women were dressed in a particular color. And so you can see that the characters are called woman in red, woman in blue, and so on and so forth, woman in yellow. And these are the characters. And of course, these characters do not stay consistent all through the play. Some repeat themselves, but women play different characters. And yet they play characters that have thematic connections with each other, and if not thematic connections, emotional connections with each other. And when this play was first developed, it was developed therefore as a kind of performance, as a way to tell the stories. The inclusion of dance, of course, created a dynamic, and I think one of the things you'll see throughout the play is a very interesting way in which the play functions along. There's a kind of emotional arc, and there's a moment in which the play reaches a kind of emotional zenith, what we'd call a climax, and of course, resolution and a denouement. So, built into this drama, where it is a series of individual poems performed, and that series will tell a story, then go to the next one and tell a story, and go to the next one and tell a story. It is still moving towards a culmination, a kind of dramatic moment, and in a moment that is going to be massively epiphanic and revelatory, and then it arrives at a kind of conclusion. The other element that I think is really important in structuring and thinking about the play is the use of a kind of chorus. And a chorus comes from the very ancient theatrical tradition of the Greek tragedy. And the Greek tragedy built itself around having a chorus of players that would be a single act, would be a single character. It would be a bunch of people, but there would be a single character, and they would speak in unison, and they commented on society. They commented on what was happening in the play. They functioned almost as a kind of stand-ins for the audience, and so when they saw something interesting happening, they would express it and they would make a claim of it. The chorus then was one of the mechanisms, at least in Greek tragedy and Greek drama, that you broke that fourth wall and engaged the audience. And Ntosake Shange uses the chorus because all the women become both the chorus and individuals. Now, I connected with Greek tragedy, which is a tradition that Ntosake Shange would have been connected to and would have known and learned and studied. But one can also connect it to Afrocentric and African tradition, the African tradition of the ring shout, the communal of people, which was one that took place in slavery, where the community would get together and each person would go in and make a move or do a dance or tell a story, and everybody would praise it, and then they would step out. There's, I don't know if you've heard of the Soul Train line. The Soul Train line is a kind of replication of the ring shout, where people go in, jump into the circle, do a move, and then come out of the circle and are cheered on by the circle. There's a lot of that way in thinking about physically how the play operates in Ntosake's plays. So we'll come back to it because, of course, there are some other elements that I want us to pay attention to in the next section.